So I came to Tyree 12 years ago, and I came because I had met someone who was living here. So he's not from Tyree, but he'd been living here for a long time. And we were expecting our first child, so I was taking maternity leave, and that just seemed like a really good time to move. I was living in Kent and working in London, so I came up here and I brought my job and was working remotely from here. So I suppose what brought me here was in partly my partner, but also a desire to live in a much more remote place. And I spent a lot of time in Ethiopia, and although Ethiopia is very different in terms of climate, there was something similar, something that reminded me of Ethiopia, like with the open skies. It was just really magical to be in a place where there's no light pollution. So that was one aspect. And to feel very remote, to be in the UK but still in a very remote place. And I've stayed because it feels like a lovely place for the children to grow up. So there's challenges, but I love the freedom that they have. Yeah. The inspiration for Buttercups and Clover really came from my experience of Rowan's growing up here. So Rowan is half Ethiopian, so she stands out quite a lot. And you know, when she was at school, she was the only black child in the school. And so I think her experience of trying to explain where she came from to her friends, you know, and the confusion around her origins, made me really think about what I could bring to this community as someone who's travelled a lot and been in relationship with someone from another country. And I was really curious to bring the idea of how we're connected to people around the world through the things that we buy and use. Yeah. Yeah, and I think what I've loved about living in this environment, for me, I've been really motivated to think about how I can create work for myself that my daughters are integrated into, you know, because I don't want to put them into a kind of childcare institution. You know, I want what we're doing to arise together, you know, so that they're very engaged with what we're doing in the shop. And, you know, I've used this as our core home education project. Mm-hmm. So for me to really integrate the children into what we're doing, so that my values, that they're experiencing the values that I'm bringing to my work as part of our family. You know, it's not that they go off to school and then I do my kind of ethical thing. I'm sort of interested in, you know, like the history of cottage industries, you know, where the loom would have been in the living room and mum would have been working. Yes. And the children would have been around her. I guess I'm trying to find the modern day version of that. Yeah. where we all learn together. You know, I feel as if my learning hasn't stopped. And so I'm learning from what the girls are learning, and they bring things, their interests bring new things to us. So I was really wanting to sell clothes, and fair trade clothes in particular, in part because I love fabrics, and because, you know, I was thinking, what kind of shop have we wanted? You know, me and the girls. So we've created a shop that's similar to the shops that we love to go to when we're on holiday. But for me, it has this underlying ethos. And I spent quite a lot of time working with a branding strategist, thinking about the values that underpin the shop. So the core values that I want to express here are beauty, equity, and welcome. And so equity, really thinking about how, as a human being, we're all equal. And what I've noticed is as I've begun to buy stock, and, you know, I don't have any background in business, so all of it has been very new, and trying to work out the provenance of something. You know, there are some things that it's very hard to really find out who they've been made by, or how, and under what conditions. So I've just found myself feeling grateful for the people that have created these products, And, you know, just even in that experience of gratitude, feeling myself connected to someone who might live a very different lifestyle from me. And then other things, you know, other companies, it's easier to find out, you know, where things are made and by whom. And then the question has arisen for me, you know, because I've chosen companies that that sell fair trade, and often fair trade is coming from Nepal or India. And so then things are being transported halfway around the world. And so then I have questions about that, you know. So on every level, it's just brought me more questions. So I suppose I just come back to those principles. And what I'm finding is that I'm opting to buy some things more locally. So like toiletries that are made in the UK, or I've got some lovely candles by a mother and daughter team whose heritage is African, but they're making them in the UK. And then other things are coming from abroad. You know, I've got a lot of things that are made from upcycled saris. I'm a grief recovery specialist, and the grief recovery method is it's actually a very, very beautiful system. It's based on the Grief Recovery Handbook that was written in the 1970s by John James after his own son had died, and he just found that there were no resources really to support him in that, and he and his wife separated. And as he did his own research and work to find out what was so wrong about what he understood about grief, you know, and how to do that differently, people began to come to him, you know, seeking support for themselves. And out of that came the Grief Recovery Handbook, and then the Grief Recovery Institute, which is based in America. And now grief recovery specialists offering this method all around the world. So it's an 8-week program. You can do it either one-to-one or in groups. And it's really learning the tools around grief. So beginning by looking at the myths that we have around grief and loss. Things like, you know, be strong. I mean, how often do we hear that? Yeah. Or grieve alone. You know, it's often not acceptable to bring our grief into the public space. And then looking at the behaviours that we engage in to keep our grief at bay. So within the grief recovery method, we call them the short-term energy relieving behaviours. So things that we do that bring some relief in the first instance, but don't really bring healing. So it could be drinking for some people, it could be shopping, you know, it could be all sorts of things, and things that aren't necessarily bad, but they don't serve the healing purpose. What we do to try and keep our feelings at bay. And then the next step is to draw out a loss history graph. And it's just a very simple graph, a line across a page, starting with your birth right up to the present moment, and marking on it the losses you've experienced. And for a lot of people, that's a revelation to really see that they've experienced many losses, and losses that have fed into each other. You know, really like John James's experience, the death of his son, and then the divorce. You know, they were related, those two losses. So you suddenly see your life through a different lens, and it opens up just a very compassionate space for yourself, really, to understand that you've experienced losses that you haven't had time to process, or you haven't even realised that you might need to process them. The next stage is then to do a relationship graph around the specific loss that you're working on. And that takes a similar format, simple line across the page with the highs and the lows of the relationship. And then you break those elements down into what we call recovery components. So the things that you might want to forgive, the things that you might want to say sorry for, and then any other emotional statement that remains. Because really unresolved grief is a incomplete communication of an emotional nature. But we don't, because we're so good at keeping grief at bay, we don't really know what it is that we've lost, or we don't know how we're feeling. So these simple steps really give you that ability to find out what it is that we've experienced and what we're feeling in relation to it. And the final stage is to write a letter. And the letter is purely for your own work, you know, it's your own healing work, and it remains within the grief recovery program. It's never sent out to anyone, even if they're still living. It's really an opportunity to express those unexpressed emotions, and it's a remarkably transformative process. So that's been training in that. You know, I've done my own grief recovery work. That's part of our commitment as grief recovery specialists, to do our own grief work. So really immersing myself in that process and then working with others, taking them through it. It's a very beautiful journey. I think what occurs to me first is that because we're so disconnected with death and our feelings around death, and we really keep at bay the idea of the body as a material thing, you know, so we have very little sense of how the human body decays, or the decomposition of the human body. So we sort of set ourselves aside, you know, because another hat I wear is as a funeral celebrant, and as an end-of-life planning coach. So, you know, making decisions around end-of-life care and the disposal of the body. So when we're very disconnected with ourselves as material beings, we're also disconnected with the land, or with the animals, or the plants. And there's massive loss in that, massive loss. You know, if I start to think about the sort of green funerals, you know, where the body might be wrapped in a shroud that has been dyed with natural plants by the people who loved the person who's died, and laid into the ground where it decomposes. And we know that that's what's happening. You know, it's not in a box, it's not covered with brass handles, it's the body's not pumped full of chemicals. When we're much more in touch with that, our grief is different. You know, we begin to know more of what we're feeling, and we begin to connect ourselves with the regeneration of the earth. You know, it's quite something to think of the human body regenerating the earth. We're not, you know, that's not a conversation we have very often. Yeah, and you know, in natural burial grounds, there's rules about what the body can be dressed in, because it's got to be something that will decompose. And you know, that raises questions about why are we wearing garments in our lives that are, you know, would be harmful if it went into the earth. To me, there's just so many questions that unfold from that.